Thank you, everyone who is joining at this point in time to the ISDA Webinar, One Firm's Journey to Implementing DRR Using a CDM. We're going to wait for others to join. We have quite a few that have signed up for this. While we're waiting, I'd like to start with the disclaimers, which you see on the screen. We'd like to remind all participants on this session on the common domain model and digital regulatory reporting that they act independently in the market. Each market participant must use its own independent judgment with respect to its own business operations. Participants are reminded that no information regarding trading activity or business strategy should be exchanged and discussed. The purpose of the webinar is to focus on the common domain model and digital regulatory reporting. The conversations remain focused on the meeting agenda distributed prior to this webinar. By participating in this webinar, you agree not to use this process to accomplish any anti-competitive goal, and you agree that you will not use any information obtained during this webinar for any anti-competitive purposes. Please note that the contents of this call are confidential. Just turning to ISDA's photography, filming, conduct policy. Registration for this event implies permission for ISDA to use, reproduce, edit, publish, and distribute any photographs or videos that ISDA or its designated photographer may take of the event or the attendees during the event. Just want to confirm with our IT, David, we are recording this session and it's on, correct?
We are recording, yes.
Thank you for confirming. I still see individuals streaming in. We did have over 200 sign up for this. I'm just going to wait another minute for others to join before we turn to the logistics, timing, and format of today's webinar. I just wanted to check that everyone can hear us okay and see the screen clearly.
Yeah, it's all good.
All good.
All good.
Thank you. I can hear some familiar voices. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for doing this so early in the morning for you.
Oh, yes. Gotta love it. So while we're waiting, I'm just going to spend a few minutes on logistics, timing, and flow before we introduce the speakers. We are a couple minutes past the starting point. So that everyone is starting at the same point of understanding. We've noticed there's quite a variety in the audience, so ISDA will start a few minutes to overview the CDM and then turn to the status, governance, and roadmap of the industry's digital regulatory reporting, what we'll call DRR work. Then we will turn to the primary focus of the webinar where JP Morgan will share their experience implementing the DRR using the common domain model, what we call the CDM, for approximately 50 minutes to an hour. I just want to sincerely thank JP Morgan, Nick, for helping the industry develop a better understanding of DRR implementation via this webinar. We are looking at other ways to provide central forums for implementers to speak to a wide group of potential adopters, on implementation experience. So more to come on that from ISDA. We'll have a Q&A after JP Morgan finishes their presentation, since many of the questions will be answered in the course of the presentation. And when we get to the point, ISDA will go through how to ask questions. We have quite a few people on, so if you're not a speaker, please mute yourself throughout the presentation. With that, let's go ahead and introduce the speakers as well as key individuals at ISDA for CDM and DRR, who you may hear from during the Q&A. I'll start with JP Morgan and then we'll move to ISDA. Can I ask today's main speaker, Nick Mosier from JPM, to introduce yourself?
Hi. Yeah, sure. So I'm Nick Mosier. I'm the product director in the regulatory technology space in JP Morgan, specifically in the equity derivatives business. I've been involved in equity derivatives change for around 16 years. The last 12 of those spent specifically in regulatory change. First half of that was spent working up to running the operations side of the change teams. And in the last half, 6 years, I've been overseeing regulatory change from a technology side.
Thank you, Nick. Now moving to ISDA, I'll start with myself. My name is Eleanor Sue. I'm sitting in New York. I'm a senior director leading the North American trade reporting for ISDA. In addition, I'm program lead for the DRR program here at ISDA. I'd like to turn to David and Tavish to go ahead and introduce themselves, please. David?
Yep, I'm David Schoen. I'm Director of Product here at ISDA, and I look after the wider CDM portfolio of work.
Thank you. Tavish?
Hi everyone, I'm Tavish Ahmed. I'm also a Product Director at ISDA, and I look after DRR. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and get started with the presentation. As I mentioned at the top, we do have quite a variety in the audience. So to make sure that everyone is starting at the same point of understanding about CDM and DRR, ISDA will briefly spend about 5 to 7 minutes overviewing CDM, what is CDM, and then also our DRR work. So I'll kick off by asking David to overview the CDM for the next 2 slides. David?
Thanks, Eleanor. So the common domain model was born out of a common market infrastructure challenge that I'm sure is familiar to all of you. Over time, every firm has established its own way of representing what are ostensibly the same contractual data. So transactions, products, events on those transactions and products, and the processes that surround them all differ from firm to firm, even though ultimately it should all be the same legal contractual obligations. So between all of these parties, and indeed within each party, all of that data representation is not aligned, shall we say. So the CDM was born to try and resolve some of those challenges. Eleanor, could you switch to 4? So the common domain model is a set of standardized digital representations for financial products, trades in those products, and the life cycle events on those transactions. It's open source, it's machine readable and machine executable. The model itself is hosted by the FinTech Open Source Foundation, which is a subsidiary of the Linux Foundation, and therefore is available under standard open source licenses. The development itself is sponsored by ISDA, ICMA, and ISLA. So our 3 associations representing quite a large part of the financial markets. We guide that development in a cross-industry collaboration model at Finos. The CDM enables interoperability and straight-through processing across firms, within firms, and across your various solutions and platforms by introducing one common standard representation across them, reducing the need for you to reconcile, and reducing the need for you to always try and get your systems to talk to each other in different languages and so on. I'm sure Nick will have more to say on how they found that later. The model can be applied to a wide range of use cases. So while today's webinar focuses on digital regulatory reporting, a lot of people are using DRR as a route into starting out with CDM and then finding that they have benefits across a number of OTC post-trade issues, challenges that they face, not just with derivatives, but also repos, securities, loans, and listed products. I will stop there, Eleanor, and hand over to you for DRR.
Thank you, David. As David mentioned, CDM has multiple use cases, collateral, et cetera. But today we are focusing on the use case of trade reporting and digital regulatory reporting. The DRR uses the CDM to facilitate the consistency of the data reported by the industry to the repositories and carries with the DRR code the industry interpretation of a jurisdiction's rules and best practices. Now, how does it do this? DRR is really an industry initiative that transforms or turns agreed interpretations of trade reporting rules, as well as best practices that are agreed, into a standardized set of machine executable code. You can visit the ISDA DRR page provided on the last slide to see which firms have been involved in the development. Just note that not all firms are shown on the ISDA website. Those digitized fields can be used for transmission to the repositories, and DRR can facilitate, UPI or the ISO and/or the ISO 2022 implementation for the various jurisdictions. The DRR code is reusable for new rules or amended rules. So what does this mean? The DRR code is developed and amended centrally. So once a requirement is coded in the DRR, it can be reused for any jurisdictional rule that adopts the same requirement. So the DRR coding for the reportable data elements that are globally recommended by the international authorities, CPMI, ISDA, FSB, and the ROC, can be applied in the DRR across jurisdictions, which reduces the effort and time needed to implement amended rules or rules, in new jurisdictions. So as we complete more and more jurisdictions in the DRR, that overlap between what's already been coded and what remains to be coded, that overlap increases, meaning that less additional DRR logic will need to be developed, so less time and effort needed to rebuild, new rules. As you see on this slide, we've done an initial analysis for Canada, which is next up for DRR and being implemented for compliance date in July of 2025. Our initial analysis is there's a 92% overlap between what's already been coded in DRR, so that 92% can be used. Now, how does the DRR code carry the industry interpretation of a jurisdiction's reporting rules and best practices? What's the governance of the DRR initiative? As I mentioned, DRR is an industry initiative which leverages ISDA's industry working group framework. The kind of long-standing ISDA data reporting working group still exists, the ones that contain the reporting SMEs, and they continue to agree consistent interpretation of rules and form best practices where needed. While the ISDA DRR working groups, the peer group, the steering committee, technical groups, review digitized rules and best practices in the DR to make sure that they're coded consistently with what the interpretation was agreed. So this means that firms adopting the code will be reporting with the industry interpretation of trade reporting rules and best practices. The key point we wanted to note here is that the resulting DRR code is freely available to all. You do not have to be a member of ISDA to access and use the code. Just turning to the next slide. My last point is that DRR is live and implemented for several jurisdictions. As you see here, we've delivered CFTC, GFSA, both EU and UK, EMIR, MOS, ASIC, and we are now in the middle of analysis for Canada. We are committed to develop HKMA, CFTC 3.3, MIFID, MIFIR when it comes down the pipeline, and the FinFrog for Switzerland, as well as SEC when they determine what they'll be doing with the safe harbor, which expires in November of next year. We will circulate the slides, but if you have further questions about CDM or DRR, please touch base with us through this email, cdmdrr@isda.org, or you can go to the ISDA webpage. Feel free to join our working groups or arrange a bilateral call. So with that, I'd like to turn to Nick for the main presentation. He'll be sharing his slides to go through their journey for implementing DRR using the CDM. Thank you, Nick.
Great. Can everyone hear and see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Cool. Okay, so just a few notes to set the scene. So the evolution of the regulatory landscape, which obviously I've been close to from Dodd-Frank to today, has had a significant impact to all of us across the industry. None of us have had the benefit of foresight on how the landscape would evolve over time. That evolution has been unavoidably staggered and inconsistent, hampering ability to strategize and innovate. The RegTech sector was born out of a shared desire to reduce the cost of compliance, but the sheer number of solutions therein could end up leading to further inconsistencies at industry level. Meeting these industry-wide challenges will be most effectively achieved through RegTech solutions which promote collaboration and open industry and interoperability. So that's just sort of setting the scene with where we're at. Now, in terms of agenda, I'm going to cover first why we as a firm went with CDMDRR. What were the perceived goals, and in terms of obtaining buy-in and making that decision to implement CDM and DRR, how we went about that. Obviously, we've not been long live, so 21st of October, we started reporting for ASIC and mass, but we've already got some realized benefits that are tangible that we can articulate, and obviously some expected future benefits as well. A brief visualization of the reporting flow, some technical considerations for implementers, some of many, but one's worth mentioning that we, I guess, wish we knew at the time, or lessons learned, and then time for Q&A at the end. Okay, so what were the goals? So in this section, I'm going to address what our high-level goals were, unrelated to CDMDRR specifically, but the issues thematically that we wanted to try and solution within the regulatory space. So this splits into three streams, one of which is technology complexity. So the evolution of the regulatory landscape over that time, where I said we didn't have foresight, has caused quite a great deal of complexity in end-to-end reporting across all of the jurisdictions. So we were looking specifically to compress our SDLC, decrease the actual physical point-to-point complexity of the flow. In doing so, give us time to enhance automation and testing capabilities, and reduce the reliance on UAT in terms of empowerment of developers. The second area is around change in control. So really your the speed at which you can change, and then post go live your control environment. We wanted to bring the business closer to the solution, which I'll explain in more detail later. Decrease the complexity of the product manager role within regulatory change. Try and create a preemptive control environment, which is, I think, the dream for everyone, to be told what your issues are internally rather than them come from another source. And increase our overall issue discovery capabilities and the sophistication of the controls. And finally, one that's often overlooked is our adaptability and recovery capabilities. So, when we do have issues, which invariably we do, how we recover from those, how quickly, and the functionality surrounding that. Addressing complexities with retrospective reporting or back reporting, and position ourselves to evolve with changing requirements. Obviously, it's not a very static space in terms of rules and regulations. Even when you're live, there's Q&As and consultations, etc., that you have to adapt to, which may also involve back reporting. So those are the goals at a high level, solution agnostic, if you like. So the first area of focus, in terms of why we were looking at CDM and DRR, it was around technology complexity. So technology complexity is often an inevitable aspect of larger firms. JP Morgan is obviously a significantly large firm with multiple lines of business across multiple jurisdictions globally. How the complexity of your technology flow influences the SDLC and change environment will directly influence your levels of ongoing risk over a period of time, regulatory risk. The design decisions that have been made over the years have obviously been made to meet immediate regulatory demands without that benefit of foresight that was mentioned. But the opportunities that have been afforded to us by CDMDRR and the RegTech sector as a whole necessitate the critique of these historic decisions with the benefit of hindsight. And as an industry, if we share our unique experiences and challenges, it will foster industry-wide solutions. So this picture is not our system flow, but I'm going to use it to visualize sort of generic challenges throughout the next few slides, challenges which were sort of catalysts for underlying changes. So obviously you can assume that this is a way of getting from source data to reg reporting via either point-to-point communication, translations, etc. So it's meant to be representative of the journey your data goes through between source and the ultimate regulatory report. Now, a quick journey back to A-level computing. For anyone, this was a useful way of representing what I'm about to explain. The data, information, knowledge, and now wisdom pyramid, which is essentially the process you go through from in one direction, translating raw data into information with more context, and then further increasing the context as you get up. That perfectly describes the pre-go live analysis for any regulatory report. You need to take raw data, you need to provide some context and go further up that pyramid until you get to what would be knowledge and or wisdom, which the regulator requires. And then post-go live, root cause analysis, issues management, you need to go in the opposite direction. So you need to start with the regulatory report, work your way back down the pyramid to the data to find issues or explanations. Now, frictionless travel in both directions up and down this pyramid is key to a successful implementation and a stable ongoing change environment, which probably goes without saying. The context that is required by regulators may not be naturally occurring in your data. So it may not lend itself or overlay itself directly. The quality of documentation here, which I'll discuss more later, plays a huge role in being able to navigate this pyramid pre and post go live. So in terms of places where you might see these issues, in terms of where there are transitions from data up the pyramid, it would be your source data to a business user interface. So the way trading and sales would look at data would be different to a regulatory report control team, for example. If you've got any internal messaging, then obviously the way that the data is transformed to suit that internal messaging is another example of contextual changes. And then if you've got data landed or pre-report data coming from that internal messaging, there's another potential change in context there. And then obviously your actual reporting logic going from that almost outbound data to the regulatory reports. So the challenges here, I'm not really talking about transformation, and I'll sort of center on that in a minute. But from a requirements gathering perspective, you need to gather requirements from sources that may be familiar with the information and the knowledge, but not necessarily the underlying data. The granularity, format, syntax, and structure of information will vary across sources, causing potential subjectivity in definition, meaning, and the resultant accuracy. So here I'm going to talk about more of the technology aspects of this sort of perceived end-to-end flow. I'm going to add in some hypothetical producer-consumer lines on these system boundaries here. So translation, even within CDM and DRR, is an unavoidable and inevitable part of regulatory reporting because no one stores their risk management data in the format that the regulator asks us to send the data in. So it's ultimately always going to be unavoidable. How effectively we document and control for translation during implementation and on an ongoing basis plays a critical role in the resultant technology and operational overhead. So what do I mean here by types of translation and where they cause issues? So the obvious one would be format and data type, whether that be system to system or schema to schema. Summarization and compression. So, for example, representing a interest rate swap schedule as parametric or explicit lists of dates. Schema to schema. Messaging to maybe message to message or message to logical data store. Cardinality. So what I mean there is, depending on the sophistication of the communication contracts between point-to-point systems, understanding the optionality of certain fields, whether they're mandatory or not, can be complex based on context. Logical to physical persistence. So if you're persisting something into a data store from an internal message or vice versa. Enumerations. Classic example, most recent one, if you speak to any trader about the words make and take, they will assume you mean price maker and price taker. In reg reporting now, it seems to mean make payment and take payment, which is, funnily enough, the exact opposite. So the importance of enumerations and their context through the flow is critical. Versioning. So what I mean here is, over time, how your data and is versioned and at what level. Is that versioning granularity the same across all points in your flow? Temporality. in terms of temporality, I just mean handling retrospective data can require custom logic to be able to back report, which we touched upon. So challenges, a bit more obvious. If you've got multiple points of translation in your flow, the number of producers and consumers will inevitably increase your challenges. Number of points of persistence. The sophistication of communication contracts, which I mentioned, obviously can mitigate some of the risks between producers and consumers. If you have a very loose contract where everything is ultimately optional with no ability to check for completeness, then it just pushes the problem further downstream. Number of intended uses for the data. So what I mean here is if you're using a common data channel or something to a common point-to-point feed, you may have to regression test said feed with multiple downstream consumers if you want to make what could be a critical regulatory change, which could slow the speed of change down. And then another one is the distribution of business logic. So how you get from your source data to your reg reporting? There is business logic, but is it all in one place? Is it ultimately distributed at different points in the flow, etc.? And then obviously the number of teams. So multiple systems means multiple teams. The complexity and speed of testing obviously is going to be impacted by all of these. Amplification of regression risk and points of failure. Quality, maintainability of lineage is a huge one. Maintaining system to system lineage is hard enough. If you've got multiple points, then it gets even more complicated, and if it's manual, then it's obviously a huge overhead. And maintenance of multiple schemas. So I'm not stating anything here that people don't know, but the angle of this is really where CDM helps us, which will become clearer in future slides. And then for us, we had to sort of amplify this flow up by multiple lines of business. And depending on the size of your firm, you might be lucky enough to just be having to do this within a single line of business. But when you've got the firm size of JP Morgan, you've got to think of how to scale this kind of thing horizontally, which just even further amplifies the problems that you face. So the second area where we thought CDM and DRR could help us is around change and control. So the effectiveness of controls in regulatory reporting is directly correlated to the ease of analysis in the pre-go live stage. Based on the two slides I've just shown, the complex requirements gathering across multiple stakeholders and systems can significantly impact the control environment post-go live. Serving information to control resources often necessitates complex build to present the information in a way that can be effectively leveraged by non-technical users. While sounding like a mouthful, what I'm trying to say there is user interfaces for, say, control and BAU teams in themselves can be complex to create, to give them the information in the format they need. Technology will be impacted significantly if access to such information is not frictionless. And finally, going into more detail on change and control with a similar diagram, what we're going to look at here is the human factor. So in any major technology change, there will also be a human factor or human impact. So we're going to overlay some hypothetical technology SMEs in different colors in this flow. We've got regulatory SMEs, so this will be your the operational change teams, or it includes legal and compliance as well. And I'm just bundling them together as regulatory SMEs here. And the most important people in the flow, the business users. So ultimately, in this flow, everyone needs to talk to each other. So if you're a point-to-point system, you've got technology teams that need to communicate with each other from a producer and consumer perspective. That could be through different systems, programming languages, geographic locations, logical boundaries such as on-prem to cloud, and completely different expertise domains. From the regulatory SME's perspective, they've got to talk to the business. And obviously they're in completely opposite domains in terms of one's a regulatory expert, the other is a business/product expert. Bridging that gap is vital. But there's one key person missing from this, which is the product owner. essentially supposed to be coordinating change across all of these domains, and they need to be communicating with all parties. So this is the world that we've lived in for a long time now, and the role of the product owner is certainly the most complex. But it is an unavoidable aspect of regulatory reporting. You do need to combine and interpret the knowledge of multiple stakeholders across different domains. Balancing the need for compliance while ensuring minimal overhead to the business functions can be complex. The potential impact. So these are more questions or thought exercises, really, is, how effective do you think your cross-domain analysis can be here with multiple systems and multiple teams? Where do you think this would cause pain in regulatory reporting pre and post go live? And is there an implicit burden on technology brought about by these challenges, which I think will be made clearer in the coming slides also. The final area where we saw CDM and DRRs being able to help us is around adaptability and recovery. So the ability to recover from regulatory issues and the functionality to enable this is often highly complex and in most cases requires manual intervention. Your go-live state is often short-lived, sometimes days, with the inevitable distribution of fixes, industry body Q&A, regulatory consultation, trade repository changes, etc., all of which would necessitate end-to-end or reporting logic changes. The implementation required for compliance will obviously is the priority, but it can negatively impact the time resource available to build sophisticated recovery tooling for go live. So that's an area that obviously we wanted to see a difference in. This inevitably leads to growing issue backlogs and associated governance overhead, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with. Okay, so once we'd, I guess, analyzed the CDMDRR use case at a high level, we, I guess, came up with some expectations to help support the buy-in. Now, these expectations align to these goals in the three areas. So this is what we expected CDM and DRR to do for us, and then I'm going to go into how it actually transpired. So this is, again, not our system diagram. I'm just articulating that we would be, in theory, compressing our end-to-end flow to be going directly from source to CDM. And DRR and the reg reporting logic essentially runs all in one execution space or one code base. So in terms of decreasing the complexity of the flow, just visually, obviously, that would be a no-brainer. With the modeling interface, which is your window into CDM and DRR there as well. So removal of point-to-point messaging was a key factor. Single source of business logic, which is DRR. And instant regulatory success feedback for developers, which I'm going to go into more information on that later. Compressing the SDLC, I think it goes without saying that if you compress the end-to-end architecture, you're compressing your end SDLC. Having one code base with all the business logic obviously has change impacts. Full end-to-end testing can be executed by a single person. And again, I'm going to go into more detail on how that's possible. Removed reliance on multiple teams, multiple points of failure, lower system-to-system regression risk, etc. Enhanced automation and testing capability. So obviously the enhancements brought about by massively simplifying the flow allow you to spend time on automation and testing capabilities. And obviously the less points you've got or the less integrations you've got in your flow, the higher the opportunities are or greater the opportunities are for automation therein. And finally, that developer empowerment. So developers have access to the full end-to-end validations, which previously was not made possible. We would rely on a downstream team to give us feedback or handle submissions to regulators in systems that we wouldn't have even had access to. Now we would envisage, a developer during build being able to understand if a given piece of work, what the impact is going to have on the actual DTCC submission, which was unprecedented. The validations, which I'll go into more details on later, allow for that. And it also has opened up avenues for data-driven build tracking and testing, which we'll detail more. In terms of bringing the business closer to the solution. So part of the change in control stream, we were expecting CDM to be, or the business to have a vested interest in CDM based on the obtaining buy-in, because CDM it has obviously value way beyond the regulatory space, which I'll go into. Because CDM is actually created by industry risk product domain experts, the interface to it and the way it works actually makes a lot of logical sense. So people from the business that we've had involved with CDM, pick it up very quickly. If you show the same set of people a regulatory report, then it's not as intuitive as to how that data is sourced, etc. But the CDM completely overlays with the traditional methods of risk management and representation. The decreasing the role of that product manager, so obviously the simpler flow should make that person's life easier. The actual modeling interface itself provides some significant advantages on cross-domain analysis and documentation, or we expected it to. And the preemptive control environment, again, we get more time, we have more resource, we will have more time to build more, sophisticated controls. But when the flow is simpler, we can deploy that expertise in fewer places and have things like automation and anomaly detection that can be built in a single place as well. Issue discovery. I'm going to go into a lot of detail on this one later, but ultimately we thought we'd be able to discover a lot more issues prior to go live with CDM. Not just that, but prior to UAT as well. So we'd shift our culture of focusing on NACs post go live to start looking at more sophisticated things like data anomalies and accuracy sooner, rather than a path to green post go live where you're trying to get to 98-99% over a period of time. And then increase the control sophistication, again, for the same reasons, having more time, having simpler flow. We expected to be able to increase the sophistication of controls. So finally, the adaptability and recovery. So having end-to-end control and visibility of the flow in one place should allow us to better handle retrospective recovery functionality through the flow. Previously, functional nice-to-haves, which I'll go into later, again, can be made available day one. And again, going to go into this in more detail, I promise, but the advanced versioning in CDM or capabilities in CDM actually helps us facilitate back reporting in a much simpler way. And then, obviously, the positioning ourselves for adaptability and recovery across the changing requirements over time. Simpler flow, we're expecting it to equate to that because there's less places to make change. In fact, it's just one or two at most. So armed with goals and expectations on how we think CDM would meet our goals, we had the workings of a value proposition and a business case for both CDM and DRR. So I'm going to talk now a bit about how we went about the process of buy-in to support the decision to go into implementation. So the decision to adopt DRR and obtaining buy-in and CDM will vary in approach and complexity across firms. Buy-in will need to be obtained from both operations and technology stakeholders. The expected benefits to the change landscape and technology are relatively simple to articulate, as I've just done in the last prior slides. However, the operational and regulatory risk benefits of DRR is also a critical consideration for obtaining buy-in, and is completely possible, but it sometimes requires a bit of message tailoring to get done. So we've articulated these three areas that we expected to see benefits. The architectural one, going from that one image to the next is fairly obvious. Now we're going to look at operational and regulatory risk benefits. So obtaining buy-in, means different things in different firms. So it could mean budget approval. It could mean, approval to go into a POC. but ultimately it requires taking stakeholders on a journey that they can relate to in a tangible way. The example I've chosen here for the demonstration of business impact, I guess it's a specific example. I'm not suggesting everyone goes through the same thing, but for us, it shows how we made what would not be an obvious KPI relatable and tangible to a wider group of stakeholders at once. So at some point, we've all, most of us would have had to deal with some query from a regulator, whether that be a question. Often, they'd like some clarification on something from your reporting, or they've identified an issue. But any number of regulatory communications can come to us. Now, the accuracy and context given in response to the regulator is highly sensitive and often requires the engagement of multiple teams to accommodate. How efficiently and accurately a firm deals with formal regulatory queries is an effective way of exposing the underlying technology and cross-domain communication challenges. Now, your firm may not operate in the same way, but normally when the regulator reaches out to the firm, it goes directly to a specialized team, legal-centric and centered on regulatory outreach. That team would then talk to one or many other teams in order to establish the response. Now, that would be usually trading, business, compliance, technology, reporting operations teams, maybe more. What usually happens, or at least in experience, is an email trail that can last a very long time, which isn't really potentially well structured and takes a lot of overhead away from all of these groups in order to establish a response. So trading and the business will, rightly so, not often be aware of the precise format and rules which govern regulatory reporting, because that's not their domain. Their domain is obviously, providing products and services for our clients. Reporting operational teams may sometimes lack deep expertise in the traded products because they're not product experts. That's where the trading and QR, etc., come in. Multiple technology teams may be involved with the translations between the core risk management data and the regulator, which we've already talked about. Compliance themselves will not be familiar with the technology flows for regulatory reporting. The functional documentation to explain all of this may be split across multiple areas in differing formats. So think of all of this together, and in terms of coming back to buy-in, as I said, how many of you have been involved in email trails where these questions have gone round the houses until they finally get to you, and you've seen that the trail's been going for potentially weeks on end, and how many groups were eventually required to respond to that single query? How long does it take to formulate the response? How long does it take for the query to reach the correct people? And how much resource is utilized in that process? So this is one of the examples of a journey you can take a wide range of stakeholders on, if this is applicable to your firm, in terms of how the underlying inefficiencies or organization for operationally and technology in the regulatory space can actually impact you in a more tangible way. Now, there are many other KPIs you could use in order to articulate the cost-benefit proposal of DRR, more obvious ones probably. Number of outstanding data quality issues, the average age of open issues, the speed or the burn rate at which you're closing your issues, the sources of issue discovery. So what I mean here is think of the potential reputational risk when comparing a client finding a reporting issue through, say, a mistake in OBO reporting or an internal control. Obviously, you'd much prefer the source to be an internal control than a client, or even worse, a regulator. The frequency of code commits. So, if you're talking to or trying to show the value of CDMDRR to, say, product management or infrastructure teams, if you're going to ultimately end up having less code commits, that's a benefit overall as well for that particular audience. The time taken to how long are you taking to turn around fixes in your current regulatory flow? Is it days, weeks, hours, months? How long does it take for you to run regression? what's your reliance on developers outside of the change process? So what I mean here is if a developer's job in the regulatory space purely starts and ends at developing, that's generally a good thing because that's what we want them to be doing, committing code, moving on to the next era. But more often than not, especially the developers that have been in the reg space for a longer period, they end up becoming sources of input into these regulatory queries where they have to explain due to gaps in documentation, etc. So what it does is it takes away the developers away from what their core role is. And then you've got benchmarks against the industry, which get published as well, and DTCC and various other trade repositories do that anonymized. So in terms of your journey to obtain buy-in, so the motivations for change are going to be different. Why we did it versus why you may do this are definitely not going to be the same. The benefits may be. But as I say, that will vary across firms. Now, the willingness to change and the urgency surrounding it will depend on the motivation. Changes in this space will invariably be viewed as high risk. Obviously, changing anything that will have a significant impact on reg reporting will not be taken lightly. But CDM does offer a unique, disruption to this buy-in process because it allows for, maybe the first time in my career, business value to be created through regulatory change, which extends beyond the immediate goal of compliance. So, as I said, we had those articulated change and technology benefits, the operational and regulatory benefits, but there's actually a third one here, which is unique to CDM and DRR, or CDM rather, which is how can CDM create value for your business? So now a huge part of the decision-making itself, in terms of buy-in, we actually spent a lot of time focusing on CDM with the business and what it can do, agnostic of DRR. So if you consider DRR one of many use cases, we went back to the alternate areas CDM could be of use, which is multiple areas. So in order to effectively articulate the value of CDM, though, the creation of targeted education is quite vital. There's a lot of new terminology. It can, not come instantly to certain audiences what CDM is. And it's a very difficult thing to articulate in one sentence unless you're a technologist. So ISDA Finos have a wide array of marketing materials which can be leveraged here. To articulate the benefits of DRR clearly, in fact, you need to first well understand CDM, because one really enables the other. And the most important point here is any investment in DRR is first and foremost an investment in CDM. That's how it should really be viewed. Is you're creating a CDM platform and its first use case, focusing just on DRR without the understanding of CDM could cause issues. I'm not going to dwell on this slide. This is as I said, around education for areas where you probably want to focus, or we focused with respect to explaining the CDM value proposition to the business. So look, there were lots of new things about CDM. It's open source, which your firm may or may not already be using. The functionality it offers, which I'm going to go into more detail, and obviously Eleanor covered it to some extent as well. The way it's governed across the industry, obviously regulatory change, you've been working in-house. How does that extend to an industry-wide problem? And then obviously the other use cases that the CDM supports, which I suggest, all of this stuff you can look at in the slides later. But these are the 4 education areas that we focused on. Okay, so obviously we actually managed to obtain buy-in because we're live. So we're live with ASIC and MAS for equity derivatives business, but we're also using it for rates, credit, FX, commodity underlyings as well. So in the short time since go live, which is, I guess, just over a week, we've already been able to identify and highlight some significant benefits. I'm going to go through some of those now and then move on to the future ones. So the areas of benefits and that's not just things we've seen in the last 10 days, but things we've seen during the implementation and the last 8 to 10 days. The four areas would be the functionality of CDM and what it allows us to do in specific areas, the benefits of industry collaboration, the improvements to development and testing, and the modeling interface itself, all coming back to that those three things that three streams we were looking to improve upon. Okay, I'm just going to take a drink for this one. Right, so I'm going to go into some detail around the flexibility of CDM creation. So this is probably the most technical part. The next few slides are the most technical part of the presentation. So it might take a couple of times reading over if you're not familiar with CDM. I'll try and explain it in a way that makes sense. So in the derivative space, there are there's more, but there's two common approaches to how you master lifecycle and risk data granularity, that I've witnessed in the firms that I've worked in. There are also, as we know, two main ways a trade can be reported. So you've got your execution granularity for MiFID and your trade for GTR. And then some regimes may require combinations of both execution and position. So ETD, for example. So creating a single data representation to facilitate both types of these reporting presents unique challenges. So what I'm going to do is take an example here of a very simple OTC vanilla option where you have a new of 100 contracts booked on T and an increase of 50 booked on T plus 5. So just to highlight the two common data representations. So this isn't CDM. This is how you would, how I witnessed it be represented in risk management systems. Is the first approach, which is more common in sort of relational database systems, where the new and the increase are independent executions, which are themselves versioned in the risk management system. So the 100 and the 50, each one of those can be independently amended. But ultimately, the execution is the primary class. Position here is built or calculated through a function of those executions. Position itself as a class may not be versioned or temporal data. And there's no discrete separation between trade and event. Often event has to be something that is derived based off complicated logic. The second approach, which is more common in more modern object-based state machine-centric RMSs, is where you separate the execution and the trade. So essentially you have versioning done at position level or trade level, depending on your terminology. So here, that new for 100, that's the event that causes the creation of the first version of your trade. Then the increase event is a separate class, which causes the state transition between the two versions of the trade going from 100 to 150. The difference here is that in the second example, your position is versioned. So version 1 is 100, version 2 is 150. But in version 1, in approach 1, that position has to be calculated at a point in time. So each of these approaches has advantages, right? They're not both good, they're not both bad. So approach 1 is very well suited to MiFID execution reporting, especially with amendments to executions that need to be reported. Because they're versioned directly, then obviously any amendments reporting is very straightforward. You have simple access to retrospective executions for back reporting. The position and trade reporting is manageable in real time, but can be complex retrospectively depending on how the position data is stored and represented. So if you need to do back reporting of a specific version of trade level class for something like GTR, that can be complicated because it means essentially executions up to a point in time, retrospectively calculating the positional impact of those, etc. Approach 2, kind of the opposite view, is very well suited to trade reporting. So for GTR, because each of your trade states is versioned. So version 1, you have the full position quantity. Version 2, you have the full position quantity. So much easier to do back reporting if that's your primary way of storing classes. The execution reporting, such as MiFID, is possible in real time because those events do exist, but can be more complex retrospectively in order to back out events from trade states. Now, the reason I'm highlighting this is we have both approaches within the firm, and coming up with a single internal messaging structure that caters to both of these has been problematic. So where does CDM help us here? So the flexibility of CDM creation allows for the representation of both native approaches. It provides reporting for both methods in a single object via DRR. It allows for direct lineage to your source data and version synchronization, but also allows for versioning and lineage of classes which may not be natively available in the underlying RMS. So remembering that in approach 1, the position itself is a interpretation or calculation of multiple executions. How would you represent this in CDM? So for those of you not familiar with CDM, I've massively compressed or simplified this into 3 streams, if you like, which is your source data as it exists in the RMS, how you're building CDM, and then your resultant trade state. So your source data is obviously your new execution here. You store in CDM an execution instruction of 100. You've created a trade state with a position of 100. The increase uses the first trade state as its before state. You pass in your source data of increase 50, which also goes into CDM, directly mapping to what you're storing in the RMS. But what CDM is able to do is actually create a trade state of 150, because CDM can use the quantity change instruction to actually position build for you. I know this may seem basic, but actually this is extremely useful functionality, because it means CDM can essentially perform the same position calculations as your risk management system would be doing at a point in time. So there's no inherent requirement for you to be calculating the position if you previously had to. But CDM also maintains a representation of both execution level and position level data. Through CDM, you've also created lineage at position level now, because obviously you've got 2 trade states. Version 1 is 150. Version 1 is 100. Version 2 is 150. But that's just been created as a function of CDM instructions. There's much more flexibility available, but that's one. I'm going to skip through this slide quickly just to save some time. But obviously, approach 2 has exactly the same impact, where you can map the event directly to be the instruction. But in this option, in this example, you've actually got 2 options. So quantity change instruction, it can do position building, but it can also do direct replacement. So you have the choice to map your version directly to quantity and have it replace the quantity, or you can actually, again, leverage the position building functionality and use the direction of increase to build a position. It's down to your preference or what makes more sense for your risk management system. The point here is you've got the flexibility to do either, and the way the CDM is represented, regardless of your choice, is identical. So that's one. The second area, qualification functions. So within regulatory reporting, this is my opinion. I think there's 2 areas that have always been a great source of complexity and business logic. One is event determination. The other is product identification and templating. So in terms of event determination, multiple risk management systems functions could be used to achieve the same trade management outcome. So what function is someone using to book a corporate action? Like, is it always obvious it's a corporate action? Ascertaining the correct regulatory event or treatment for the risk management event can be complex. In a stateless messaging system, complex comparisons across messages may need to be used to establish what the intent of a specific event was based on what was there before, what is there after. From a product side, any point-to-point messaging or persistent structure which is templated by product inherently requires the assignation of product prior to building the message. So what does that mean? It means as a Java developer, for example, you have a option builder, a swap builder, a credit default swap builder. You end up with a lot of code redundancy and a product-centric builder pattern, which need to all be maintained for consistency, etc. there can be more than one way of representing the same risk profile using different payoffs in reality. And sometimes you end up having to crowbar certain product representations into generic formats, or they don't, or you have to keep customizing the builders in order to fit what you need. Regulatory overheads such as UPI and ISIN requests factor into this complexity as well. So how does CDM help this? Now, I think one of the most beneficial functions in CDM is its qualification functions. So it has event qualification and product qualification. So what do we mean by this? So CDM separates the functional representation of the event, the instruction, which is, I gave a brief example on earlier, from its intent. So when you're building CDM, you can run the event qualification function, which will determine the true business event based on the data supplied. Now, it's not magic, but it allows you to basically represent any number of business events with a very small number of primitive instructions. So you can think of a primitive instruction as what is actually happening at the lowest level of granularity to my contract. Am I changing the quantity? Am I changing a party? Am I changing contractual terms, etc.? The what you're doing and the why or how you're doing it get separated. So you're able to basically say your intent of this overall action is to enact a corporate action, but you can use any number of primitive instructions to represent that. And there's also a multiplicity flexibility here as well. If it takes you 2 events to do a quantity change, i.e. you have a reversal trade that backs out one trade and then a replacement trade that gives you the new version. If you wish to, you can model those as lower level primitive instructions grouped into a single business event, which may have required like filtering or complex logic in a point-to-point messaging system before. The product aspect means you can move from a builder pattern example to a payout builder pattern from a product builder pattern. So in CDM, the way that there's I think 8 or so payout legs that are used as building blocks to represent any product. So the interest rate leg is used across an interest rate swap, an equity swap, credit default swap, etc. Well, not credit default swap, but interest rate swaptions, etc. So let's say you're building a performance leg in CDM with an equity index underlier, and you've defined some price return terms, and you instantiate a fixed interest rate. CDM will qualify that product for you, tell you that it's an equity swap price return basic performance based on the sort of high level ISDA taxonomy. That qualification can then be used to drive logic downstream. Now this flips the idea of templating on its head, where we've previously had to say, okay, this product is a swap, I need to fit it into a swap template, and then run your rules or business logic. Now you will get feedback on what the product is and validation failures where it doesn't meet certain criteria at the point of build, so you can move to a redundancy-free builder pattern, if you like, where you've only got to have logic to build payout building blocks of certain products. I may have not explained that well, but it would make sense once you start implementing, or if you start implementing. The final, which area? Okay, yeah, the final part of the CDM, more technical explain, is around the context that a CDM object can give you. So the projection of a CDM object in JSON is not just a message, it really does tell a story through the use of a state machine. Now, the possibilities afforded in terms of lineage and contextual awareness with a single message are far beyond prior implementations. Very brief terminology here. Workflow step is a wrapper for a unit of trade management being carried out. But as well, the rest of the payload of a CDM message includes the high-level business event details, such as the intent, which we mentioned, and timestamps. The instructions, which is a much lower level, the primitive instructions that are about to be carried out, and that's one or many. It also includes a copy of the prior trade state, which is what the trade was before entering into this set of instructions. And then it shows you what the resultant trade state is after. So CDM, any use case that uses CDM has access to all of this. It's not just the current state of the trade, but it also says what it was before and what's happening. It's a rich source of information, and all available in a single projection. So in terms of development and testing benefits, what we've seen so far. So as a developer in CDMDRR, you have that empowerment that we talked about. You basically have the ability in a single thread to get validation on CDM creation, validation, your product and event qualifications, your CDM object cardinality, syntax structure, FPML validations, and data types all given to you as part of the build feedback. You can run these validators. And then from a DRR perspective, when you run the reg transaction reports, you get regulatory validations in terms of attribute completeness, accuracy, compliance. And when I say compliance, I mean, the regulatory rule compliance, and also some trade repository rules as well. And then when you further go beyond creating the report and you create your ISO message, you get your ISO schema validations in as well. All this is available to a single point of execution, which has been, I still think, the standout success as part of simplifying the technology flow. With developers are empowered to run their own end-to-end regression on one machine if they want to. Now, in terms of quotes from developers, I will skip over this because I realized that we're taking quite a lot of time. But one thing I will just quickly call out is around database I/O. So those primitive instructions, in a point-to-point messaging system, you often have to extract the same data for multiple messages, even though that data is staying the same. So if all you're doing is an increase or an unwind, inherently you're only changing the quantity. So that's what happens in CDM. So when we create an increase or an unwind, it's basically the data that's extracted is almost like an update statement to say update the quantity from 10 to 12. We don't have to extract all the data for all the parties, the instruments, the product, again, as part of that. So we see a huge reduction in post-trade event database I/O. There are other examples on here, but I want to move on if possible. Industry collaboration. I think this is more self-explanatory, but we've seen we wouldn't be able to be where we are if it wasn't for the collaboration we've had with the industry. And there's some really bright people in these forums, very helpful, and it's an exciting direction to be going in. So most firms, I think, will find that CDMDRR suits their needs out of the box, but the spirit of open source contribution is where there are customizations required for your business. The governance is there, the framework is there for you to contribute back to the code in an open source fashion. The modeling interface, so how you look into the model, the interactive user interface, this is a huge win for documentation. In fact, I wrote some, I guess, matrix style specifications in terms of mappings, but in terms of detailed business like rules, lineage, and everything else, we didn't need to because it's all interactive and there within the modeling interface with full traceability from the actual regulation down to which Q&A, etc. it came from, right down to the source in CDM. And it's a living document. So whenever there's a new version of the code, obviously the actual DSL is changing as well. So it never goes out of date. It's in human readable language. It's a dream if you've had to deal with point-to-point systems with multiple translations, essentially. And lineage, again, was an obvious problem I mentioned earlier, but that it's also end-to-end baked into the solution. But one of this, I guess, less or more subtle areas around the advantages where we had those different users and cross-domain expertise communication is this gives you an interface into the CDM, which can be well understood by business users, which can directly translate through to the regulatory rule. So if you do need to combine the business user and the regulatory SME in a conversation, you have a single interface in which you can basically be the glue between those two stakeholders. Expected future benefits. So obviously we're ASIC and mass live now. We expect to move on to other jurisdictions and other areas next year. We are expecting to realize longer term absolutely a lower cost of technology and operations overall, because the incremental cost of adding jurisdictions to DRR, as Eleanor touched upon, is much, much lower because of reuse. The future rewrites that will come into play, Q&As, etc., will be handled at industry level, and we'll tackle them as an industry, but we're expecting that to translate to lower costs as well. Value creation for the CDM for alternate CDM use cases, faster discovery of reporting issues. We're already seeing some of this, but faster recovery from reporting issues. Definitely increased sophistication of controls. We've already started on that journey. And then further reduction in complexity using other DRR use cases, such as the UPI request creation, for example. Essentially, it's a unique opportunity to create business value, CDM, I mean, over and above compliance within the regulatory agenda. So in terms of another bit more technical slide, so what you can do with CDM, what we've done with CDM, we've only really scratched the surface. There's multiple ways you can implement CDM. So one of which is, in theory, you could build it as, or use it as your core state machine. So you could build systems and workflows on top of CDM rather than it be something that is backed out of a system based off an event trigger. You can use CDM to integrate it to run system to system, or use it to user workflows such as matching or order to execution. You can project to external platforms such as venues and vendor solutions, which are coming up all the time. You can decide to create CDM transiently, i.e. create it in order to facilitate some system-to-system transmission and then throw it away, or you can persist it. You can ingest FPML and directly translate that into CDM. CDM, obviously, being an object-based model, it can be persisted directly into an object-based data store, or you can store the projections as in document stores, for example. It has functionality for determining cash flows and generation, contract intrinsic event management, observations, fixings, resets, historization, advanced regression analysis, where every aspect of the CDM has a unique hash key called a global key, which we're going to focus on in regression analysis, where we can basically look at the before and after differences and zoom into individual classes. But also, if you had business logic around amendments, it comes in useful there as well. The ability to model custom risk and payout calculations, or even custom financial products. Digitization of documentation, so collateralization and legal documents is digitized within CDM. Direct integration into clearing and settlement, collateral management. I could go on, but there's a huge number of things you can do with this. And in terms of extensions to CDM, so if you take DRR as being generalized as a rules-driven interpretation of CDM targeting a specific business case, reg reporting, there are other things you could do on top of CDM longer term, such as party-based regulatory eligibility, regulatory product treatment logic, such as what constitutes a Dodd-Frank swap, projection to user interface or document schemas within your firm, downstream system-to-system projections, control report projections, pre-trade checks, contextual interpretations like ESG analysis. Also, with it being a standardized model is a gateway requirement for much more sort of advanced use cases. The things I've mentioned around the validations and the functional integrity verification that's built into CDM really enhance the robustness as a standard model. So extensions which could benefit from this in the future include API discovery for data access, blockchain integration, which some vendors are already doing, targeted LLM training, custom financial product creation. So versatility is obviously a key here. It basically, it's a platform that unlocks the countless possibilities for innovation and efficiency in financial operations. Its evolution through open source contributions is essentially boundless, empowering us, the community, to influence and shape its future. Now, at a high level, I'm going to quickly show you what the logical flow looks like. I don't think there'll be any surprises because I've kind of described it, specifically focusing on what feedback is available at runtime. So we have a semi-native implementation of CDM. So it's an existing risk management system with a event publisher, if you like, which is essentially just a trigger. That trigger wakes up our CDM builder, which maps the risk management system event to CDM. That's the only part where we've really had to do any significant build. But that build has been made easier by the flexibility of CDM and actually the closeness to its representation to the underlying risk management system. So once you create your CDM, what you're really doing from that point onwards is you're on a chain of like 1 or 2 lines of code to get from CDM through to regulatory report. Each section is minimal. It's essentially passing an object between multiple functions. But each step has its own validators, which do different things at different levels. I've explained some of the CDM validations and the qualifications. This is the stage that would happen. Once you've got your CDM object, you then create your reportable event. Now, the reportable event is really just a CDM object plus another class called reportable information, which carries with all your regulatory info, like your UTIs, your small scale buy-side indicator, which I think is one of the new ones. But this is an important part because it means you can essentially have CDM exist without any data that's required for regulatory reporting if you wanted to. You could also go straight to reportable event if you wanted to. But obviously we want to look at using CDMDRR for alternate use cases. So we wanted a sort of reg-free CDM as well as reportable event to exist. Now, when you create reportable event, it has its own validator as well. What it's really doing is running these CDM validations again, plus the validation specific to the reportable information class. Once you've got your reportable event, which is really, think of it as CDM plus object, then you start going into the lower level DRR creation. So the first thing you do is create a transaction report, whether that be ASIC or MAS. And it's at this point when the more regulatory specific validations will run. That includes all kinds of like sources in terms of the actual regulatory validations in which ESMA published, the DTCC specifications or trade repository specifications around cardinality, structure, data format, CDE validations, etc. All of that runs in one place. Assuming you get through there in the green, the final step is to generate your ISO. And again, there you have ISO validations, schema validations that come out, and if you get through that, what you've essentially got is a message that you know internally will pass when you send it to the trade repository, but without sending it to the trade repository. Now, this is fairly new to us. I know maybe that kind of thing has existed before in other firms, but actually having 99.9% confidence or 100% confidence, in fact, now that the internal success rate matches the external success rate, it has been hugely valuable, especially in terms of automation. Not having to wait for DTCC to get early visibility feedback is brilliant. So technical considerations, managing to get through it now. Okay, so these are things that I guess I wish I knew like 6 to 9 months ago. It's not that the information was hard to come by, but it was key points in our journey that that if I was explaining to someone else how to go about it, these were things that I would mention as key things to understand. One is your ability for your firm to take in open source software. Might be easier said than done. You may have an infrastructure or a team that are already doing code scanning and open source promotion within the firm. Essentially, if you can't take the open source code into your firm, you're going to have a problem. So this is really the most important gateway or barrier to sort through first. I did touch on this, but deciding on your implementation pattern, whether you create CDM transiently or you persist it in an object store, has a quite critical impact on your architecture or your resultant architecture, and there's pros and cons to each. You don't necessarily need to store CDM, but then if you are trying to do a full state management with CDM, you're going to have to synthesize what was essentially the prior state as well as the resultant instructions. So you could end up with more complexity there. We've gone with a storage and audit of full CDM objects. record keeping requirements obviously might need to be considered here, depending on what jurisdiction you're looking at. Again, I think we've mentioned this, but the logical separation of CDM and DRR, that was an intentional thing that we did, where we wanted CDM to exist outside of the realms of regulatory processing. So we have both a CDM object and a reportable event separately. You don't necessarily need to do this. You can, if you wanted to start with go straight into the DRR solution, you wouldn't need the CDM that exists without the reportable information, for example. Reportable event. So this is the CDM object that facilitates the ongoing DRR rules. You can create one reportable event to handle all jurisdictions, or you actually have the flexibility to have one jurisdiction per reportable event. We've gone with all jurisdictions in one reportable event because we don't see any risks in being, if you think about it, the way DRR works, the code is run after the point of reportable event. So if you've got a problem with one specific jurisdiction, or a rule or something, or an issue with how that rule's running, it's the rule that would need to be rerun, not the object that needs to be recreated. Obviously, you may have accuracy issues in the object, like let's say your quantity is wrong and you've got a bug, but would you rather recreate that across 4 jurisdictions or just one object that services them all? There's pros and cons again, but we think we're on the right track with what we've done here. Identification of sources and triggers. So this is a critical part of CDM design. Bearing in mind, not all trade management events are considered reportable events. You may need business logic between CDM and DRR to cover some levels of regulatory event eligibility. Now, we manage that in the upfront CDM space. So, take an example, expiries, we specifically don't report. And at the event level, we identify those and we don't put them through to reportable event. It's minimal logic here, but if you're going to send every single RMS event into CDM, you just need to be cognizant of that event eligibility aspect. But it's when you create a reportable event, you can choose not to create the reportable event ultimately, or you can even override the action type. The action type is derived for you by DRR, but you can override the action type at runtime as well under certain conditions if you need to. And finally, again, this is probably implicit, but aligning your CDM classes and events to risk management. So the closer you can map CDM to using first principles back to your risk management system, the easier things will become. If you have two actions in the RMS to represent one thing, represent it as 2 instructions, and in CDM as well. Try not to compress or expand on to get from one to the other. The flexibility you'll see in CDM should allow you to get very close, at least in all the examples we've seen, to the actual lowest level of granularity. So that's the last slide. So just some closing remarks. So I think obviously while the immediate value proposition of CDM demonstrated today has been DRR, embracing this technology will place you as a firm or us as a firm at the forefront of the upcoming evolution of B2B communication and finance. The possibilities afforded by CDM extend across all business lines and processes, and firms are in a position to influence its evolution to provide further future value for their clients. It's a disruptive paradigm shift, which is something we don't get to say very often in the regulatory space, which has the potential to change the way we do business, simultaneously lowering regulatory risk when coupled with DRR. And one thing I'll add is, in that 12 years that I've worked in the regulatory space, it's not often I can't think of any other time actually I've ever been able to say that something exciting is happening in that space. It's not the most exciting area to work, but it definitely is valid to say that now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. That was very, very informative. I we'd like to have a Q&A. There are a couple ways you can ask questions. You can type a question into the Q&A box, or you can simply raise your hand. I do want to say that any questions that can't get addressed in this forum, if you send it to the CDMDRR mailbox, we'll endeavor to answer them as well if we run out of time. So I see a question. Shruti, if you'd like to go ahead with your question for Nick.
Hi, yes, I'm Shruti from UBS. My question to you, I mean, this was really informative. Thank you very much for this. My question to you is, have you adopted CDM for just reg reporting or front to back, Nick?
So we've adopted it with the primary use case for regulatory reporting, but with the preemptive view that we want to use it for alternative use cases. So we've already started talking to the business about where this could go, where it could go going forward. We've already built and segregated CDM from the regulatory processing, so we're ready to do it. But that was factored in from the start. We didn't want to have to decide later that, someone else wants to use CDM, we have to make loads of changes. It's something that has been baked into the solution.
Oh, okay. So is it the upstream systems that send you the data in the CDM format, or do you guys?
No, so
is it the downstream?
At the moment, it's a post-trade processing. So basically, upon booking, whatever that booking action may be is translated into CDM for the purposes of post-trade processing at the moment. So it's not used in the pre-trade space yet.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
I see another hand raised. I think it's Yogesh. Can you just identify what firm you're from? Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, Nick. I'm Yogesh. I'm from RPC.
I think
we lost you.
Yeah, I think you're on mute.
Okay, I don't know why I'm going on mute.
Okay, we can hear you now. Go ahead with your question.
Okay, right. So the translation that happens from your RMS system to CDM.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you can hear me. I can see some.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead. You said the
Yes.
translation from RMS to CDM.
The translation that happens. Are you using FPML to do the translation? Is the CDM taking FPML?
No, it can, but we don't do that. So we have a Java layer. It could be Java or Python, depending on what distribution of CDM you use. But we have a layer to directly translate the native RMS event into CDM. So we don't have FPML in the flow. We didn't look at that because it wasn't applicable to us. But obviously, if you've already got FPML in your firm, that is a direction you could look to go.
Got it. Thanks. And one last question. The responses back from regulators, I
lost the second part to that question.
My connection is really bad. So the responses from CDM, responses from regulators, are you using CDM for that?
When you say the responses, do you mean the coming back from the trade repository? No. So ultimately, the submission out the door to the regulator is still the ISO 2022 message, and when we deal with responses, it's the traditional acknowledgement. Okay. Now CDM it stops its work, or DRR stops its work at the moment at the point of submission. Obviously it could be extended longer term to handle stateful representation of submission in terms of ACNAC, back reporting. But at the moment, its work is done. Once that ISO message is created, you've got to handle the ACs and NACs yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see another hand up. I think it's Wenji Lee. If you'd like, could identify what firm you're from?
Yep.
Go ahead.
Hey, it's Wenji from UBS. You mentioned the native RMS translation into CDM, and that translation of kind of what typically I think you were saying, like I think in most firms it's like template-based products into kind of CDM format. Ultimately, I guess is in my mind that's like one of the biggest parts of work because of how many kind of different product combinations and templates, etc., probably can exist within firms. So how do you have you just built that once and then you plan to maintain that, as you mentioned, kind of a Java layer? And is that the biggest piece of work as part of implementing CDM, or do you see there being something else that's kind of jumps out as this is the hardest lift that we had?
I think it takes up the largest proportion of build before someone is able to perform UAT. Obviously, if you can't create the CDM object, you can't run the DRR code. So it's kind of if you look at it from a DRR perspective, you need a working CDM object in order to be able to function. But to your point, it's I promise I'm being truthful here, but it's a logical exercise mapping, or at least it has been for us, mapping the RMS data to CDM because of the way CDM has been built and who it's been built by, and the inputs into that build process. Like if you get the opportunity to look at it, the way the payouts are organized and the way that the trade is separated from contract, separated from product, it makes logical sense. So the exercise of mapping was actually a lot more straightforward than we've seen in the past. But in terms of the message you see, or the JSON that you see come out of CDM, the projection, that's just a serialization of the object. It could take on any form in the future. So we don't look at that when we're mapping. We're looking at the Java functions and the cardinality of them to say, this is how you create an option payout. There's obviously a Java function created by the DSL that says these are the things you need for an option payout with a class hierarchy, etc. in Java or Python, depending on your distribution. So we weren't looking at messaging templates or even product templates at any point, really. We were navigating the visual UI, which is a visual representation of the underlying code that's generated for Java, and going straight from the database to the Java classes, if you like. And then that projection that comes out is your projection from Java to the CDM JSON object. Does that make sense? Am I making sense? There's no message, if you like, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think so. No, thanks. That's really helpful.
Thank you. And I noticed we're a couple minutes past time. We'll just take the last question from Quinn. I believe you're from Traction FinTech. Want to go ahead with the question, please?
Yeah. Hi, Nick.
Hello.
Thank you. It's great to hear of someone who's gone through the digital regulatory reporting process. We do the regulatory reporting for a lot of small buy-side firms. And what I was wondering is, do you see it as being suitable for smaller companies? Obviously, JP Morgan, is a much bigger team, has a lot of resources. But at what level do you think the overheads of getting involved in the common domain model and digital regulatory reporting sort of become worthwhile compared to perhaps using a template or a sort of service provider or some other form of reg reporting?
Yeah, I think it comes down to what I talked about earlier around the motivations for change. So whatever they may be, if it's cost centric, or you've had a regulatory issue, or clients are asking you to do OBO reporting and you want to pick that up, it really comes down to that. Like, I think everyone would benefit from it, regardless of the size of firm. If you're talking about CDM, absolutely everyone, because of the future opportunities, because big firms need to communicate with small firms. So bidirectional communication in CDM longer term opens up huge number of possibilities. In terms of DRR, I think absolutely. I think even if we had one jurisdiction, where we only have two now, and it's actually not huge volume that we've got, but we're seeing huge value on that, zoomed in on that area. So I would say, yes, it will be an implementation investment, the initial investment, but that incremental benefit, I think, will impact smaller firms it from a percentage perspective, if you like, in the same way as it would impact larger firms, right? Because it's that incremental benefit that we're in it for, and that industry level, all heads at the table solving the problem. I think it's that aspect to it that I think would benefit everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. And I think we're over time. Just my last, I just want to close here. Thank you very much, Nick, for sharing your experiences today. In terms of logistics, we do, after compliance sign-offs, plan to circulate the deck and also the tape sometime after the webinar. Again, Nick, thank you very much, and everyone for joining today's presentation.